Now, something that we Muslims hear very, very often, which I think people are starting to take for, I think people abuse it. Anytime we bring up something about the Old Testament that does not go with our modern day society, what people usually say is, and even some apologist Christians agree with me, they say, Christians should not be doing this. When they have a problem or there's a fit with a passage in the Old Testament, immediately, oh, no, that's the Old Testament. Without analyzing the scripture. Because when we say, oh, that's the Old Testament, as if you're saying, oh, that's an old God. No, rightfully so. That's there for a reason. In the history there, the Old Testament, it's not a day's history. It's not a 2 days history. We're talking about a history of thousands upon thousands of years. So the Old Testament, and I would like literally to see a Christian Reformation where the Old Testament is reappreciated. Because a lot of people so very often, oh, that's the Old Testament, right? But for you to understand who Jesus truly was, you can't read the New Testament solely by itself. Because the historical Jesus, was an upright Jew. He worshipped one God. He prayed with his head facing down on the floor. He worshipped in a synagogue. He didn't worship in a place where he was looking at his own photo. He was reading from the Old Testament scripture because he was a Jew. He worshipped on Saturday, not Sunday. He believed in a theocracy, not a democracy. Because the pagan Romans were the people who believed in a democracy and man-made laws. But Jesus adhered to the laws of God that are found clearly and explicitly in the Old Testament. So if someone truly wants to appreciate who Jesus was, the first place to look at is not in the Gospel of John. The first place to look at is for you to understand the mindset and the mind view of who Jesus was, and the historical Jesus is for you to read the Old Testament. Because Jesus himself was an erudite Jew, right? And he was called a rabbi and he was called a teacher. You see? Now, and that's very important. Furthermore, the apostles, if you also want to understand the apostles were not worshiping on Sunday. They weren't worshiping in a church. They were not worshiping, they were not reading the letters of Paul. So if you truly want to understand also the mindset of the apostles of Jesus, we would then also have to refer back to the Old Testament. So I think we need to pay the Old Testament, we need to revisit the Old Testament, and we need to read it diligently rather than just kind of throw it in over our backs and, oh, that's the Old Testament, the stone, we don't do that anymore. That's the old. Well, how come you take this verse? So it kind of creates a conflict.